Okay, welcome to the very first video of the AZ-800 series. The first topic we're going to get into is Active Directory, which makes up about 35% of the exam, so it is significant and is something you want to know pretty well. The first section in Active Directory, we're really going to talk about three topics. That's going to be 1, how to set up a new domain. 2, we're going to look at configuring and installing domain controllers. And then finally, we're going to cover a topic called FSMO Roles, what those are and how to set them up. This particular lesson is pretty small for content-wise, so it should be pretty quick and easy. And let's go ahead and get into it. Now, since we're talking about setting up a domain and domain controllers, the first thing we want to go over is what are the prerequisites to get an Active Directory domain working and functioning. Let's assume we have an environment already that's running one domain controller. We'll call it DC1, and this is going to be on a 10.0.0.1 address that I'm just shortening to 10.1 for the sake of drawing on a whiteboard. And now let's say we want to add a second server. We've already stood up the server, we've called it DC2 in anticipation that it's going to be a domain controller, and it's got an IP of 10.2. Now, the first prerequisite, the most obvious one, and the one that's kind of assumed here because they're both on 10.0.0 IP space, is you have to have network connectivity. The domain controllers have to be on the same network so that they can talk to each other. So, that's assumed, right? The next prerequisite that is probably the most important and the one that trips up a lot of students as they're learning about Active Directory is DNS. Now, I'm going to take a second here to step aside and talk about how important Active Directory and DNS are together. You can't have one without the other. So, special note over here. Active Directory, whenever you think about it, also think of DNS. Those two are hand in hand. They go together, and you can't have one without the other. So, if we're promoting DC2 and in the same domain as DC1, the requirement we have to do to make sure this works is DNS on DC2 has to be configured to point to DC1 for DNS. So, we are configuring DNS on DC2 to point to DC1. We're also going to talk about DNS settings as we're promoting domain controllers in the demo that I'm going to run later, but just pointing this out. This is a requirement. Now, this is all you need to get Active Directory working and promote a domain controller into this domain. But there is a separate exam objective for this section that talks about how you promote a domain controller in Azure, which is a little bit different, but essentially the same thing using these principles. So let's say we have a server in Azure. We're going to call it Azure DC1. And this is our Azure environment, separate from our on-prem network. Using the prerequisites we talked about already for here, it's exactly the same thing, it's just extending that environment. The difference is this is in Azure, so you need connectivity. Either a VPN, which is more common for small or medium-sized businesses, connecting your Azure environment and your on-prem environment, or if you're in a larger business, you might have an express route, which is like a direct pipe to the Azure environment. What this allows then is network connectivity between Azure and your on-prem network, which is the first prerequisite, network connectivity. The other thing that you're going to need is this same element, DNS. Now, for an Azure environment, you don't usually statically set IP addresses or DNS. You can set DNS, but it's bad practice to set static IP. However, on your virtual network in Azure, you can specify what your default DNS servers are. In this case, let's assume this has already been configured. You have DC1 and DC2. I can set the default DNS servers on my Azure environment to 10.1 and 10.2 for this subnet. And now when I promote this server and connect it to the VNet, it automatically gets DCs 1 and 2 as this DNS server, which will allow me then to promote this DC to a domain controller in my on-prem domain. That's all you need. So we're talking about prerequisites, two things: network connectivity, DNS, and that's about it. The other thing you need is permissions, but we'll get into that in a second. So the other thing that we're going to talk about in this video is FSMO roles. I'm going to touch really briefly on what those are. In a domain environment, every single server replicates everything. It's all got a copy of the database that includes all of the users, groups, other settings you've configured for that domain. It's also assumed that when someone's interacting with a domain, they can talk to any domain controller and that will just work because they're supposed to be exact copies of each other. However, in any environment where there's replication occurring, there are certain activities that have to be performed by a single source to prevent conflict. One of those examples is if a user is resetting their password and changing their password, that request has to go through one server to validate that it's not being changed in two different locations, in which case they have a conflict and they don't know which password is authoritative. So there are things called FSMO roles, which basically stand for certain functions in your domain that have to be performed by one domain controller. And you specify what domain controller holds those FSMO roles or which domain controller is responsible for those functions. We're going to talk about those a little bit more, but that's the concept behind FSMO roles. If you hear FSMO or read FSMO or FSMO, that means it's roles or functions that have to be performed by one single server. That's really it for the prerequisites that I'm going to go over. So let's cut over to the demo environment and let's see what this looks like live to configure it. If you have not yet watched the AZ-800 intro video I put up last week, it might be worth going back and watching it just because I go over some of the different tools that I'm providing for you for each one of these videos for you to optimize your learning. That's based on a book called Make It Stick that is all about the best ways to learn and retain information. That's another book I'd highly recommend that I'm going to keep linking below because it is really, really good. I recommend it for anybody who's learning. But part of those tools that I'm providing is in a GitHub repo. I am creating ways for you to deploy lab environments yourself so that you can go through all this content firsthand. It's really important to get firsthand experience for this, so I'm trying to make that really easy for you. The only thing you're going to need is an Azure environment, an Azure subscription, so you can deploy the resources into to work with. These are only going to cost a little bit. You can work a whole bunch of times as long as you're disciplined about deploying the lab when you need it and then destroying all those resources when you don't. It's only going to cost you a couple dollars a month to run. Or the first time you sign up for Azure, you can get free trial credits, and I believe you can run all these labs on those trial credits, and you shouldn't come anywhere close to the free, I think it's $200 that you get when you first sign up. So I would definitely take advantage of that. But to show you how that works, I've got this repo divided up by the different sections that the exam covers in the study guide. And we are starting today on our first section, Active Directory Domain Services, and the first lesson on how to build DCs. So what I have here is this page goes over lab scenarios that you can go over on yourself to challenge it. But more importantly, I have in this Terraform directory the ability to deploy the lab we're going to be using in the demo today for the videos. So to show you how that works, I have this repo synced locally to VS Code. You'll notice my directories over here mirror what you saw in that repo online. So let's open this up, and I'm in this directory, and I'm going to show you what it looks like to deploy this lab via Terraform really easily from the repo. So the first thing I have to do is navigate to the directory. I can type change directory 1 tab to get in that folder, 1 tab for the first lesson, and then my deployment is in the Terraform folder. And the only thing that I have to do here is I need my subscription ID in Azure that I'm going to deploy the resources to. So as long as I have that ready in the portal, I'm going to pull it up off screen here, so give me 1 second. Once you have your subscription ID that you are going to deploy the resources into, all you have to do then is type in from this directory, Terraform apply, and hit enter. And it's going to read those deployment files that I've written for you. It's going to prompt you for a couple values. The first one here is subscription ID. So let me just copy that. This is what I was just looking up. Hit paste, enter, and it's going to prompt you for a password. This is the password for any user in the lab environment. So I have this written so that every user uses the same password. That's easier for navigating a lab, just so you don't have to try and remember separate passwords. Obviously not best practice, but works just great. And what you're going to see here is going to pop up and tell you exactly what's going to be created if you care to look at the plan. You don't really have to look at it. And then it's going to tell you, do you want to perform these actions? And type in yes, and it will start to deploy. Now, I'm probably going to skip some of this because it's going to take a few minutes to deploy, but while this is going, I thought we could take a look at quick. In this repo, I have a document called the deployment guide. Now, this is ugly, so let me go back to the browser. I'm in the repo, and here's my README. I can click on deployment guide, and I've provided instructions on how to deploy labs with Terraform. So this talks about you have to navigate to the Terraform directory like we did. You do have to run a couple of commands, Terraform init, and then you can run Terraform plan to show you what's going to be created. And then once that's ready, you run Terraform apply, and it's going to list a public IP. So the instructions are here to help you deploy those labs if you want. I also have a method where you can use the Azure portal and a GUI link to deploy that lab. If I navigate back to that same lesson directory that we're in and I go to labs, this button right here will do the same thing, but it's more of a graphical user interface. I do recommend people learn Terraform, but that's all you have to do. So going back here, all these resources are still deploying. I'm going to fast forward a little bit until this is done, and we will continue with our demo. Literally, as soon as I hit stop recording, it finished. So it was really quick. Now, the only thing that's important to know here, it shows everything was deployed and then gave me a connect IP right here. I take this public IP, I copy it, I open my remote desktop client. I know that's really small. I paste in the IP address that I copied from right here, hit connect, and it's going to connect to that Azure server that was just created, and then all I have to do is type in the credentials to connect. Now, by default, I have the username set to lab_admin. You can see that in the Terraform config. If I look at the variable under username right here, default is labadmin. That's also listed in the lab instructions right here. Default username is labadmin. And then for the password, it's the password that you set when you were prompted. Hit OK, and it shows you you're connected to DC1, which is the first lab server that we have connected. Go ahead and hit yes, and it will connect me into that server. All right, switch in here into the RDP window directly for our exam content. This is going to be a little bit slow because it's literally, the server was just created. It's the first time it's launching. I also have these lab servers set to a smaller size so they're less expensive. Apart from the very initial launch like this, really small servers work just fine and they're really inexpensive. So it's kind of a trade-off as long as you're willing to wait in the beginning. But while this loads, I'll just wait here for a second. Okay, I waited just a few minutes for everything to finish loading, so hopefully we don't have to deal with a lot of lag while that happens. I'm connected here to my DC, and it automatically pops up into the server manager. Now, because you're taking the AZ exam, I'm going to go ahead and explain this. This is going to be pretty simple to some people, but just bear with me if you already know it. The server manager is where you go to install any roles or features that you want the server to operate under. So under here, if I go to manage, you'll see you've got two options: to add roles and features and to remove roles and features. Roles and features define what a server is used for in the Microsoft space. So the first exam objective that we're talking about here from the study guide is install a domain controller, a new domain controller into a new domain. So in order to do that, in Server Manager, I go to Manage, Add Roles and Features, and this menu pops up. This is a very common menu to do anytime you're doing this. Hit Next, Next. You select the server you want to manage. This can be used to manage other servers, so that's uncommon. Go to Roles, and to install Active Directory, what I have to do is check the box next to Active Directory Domain Services. I always like to make sure this Include Management Tools is checked as well. Click Add Features, and then next, 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 install. And there you go. It is now installing the Active Directory role onto this server so it can be configured as a domain controller. I'm going to point out here one thing that might not be obvious, but is good to note for the exam. When you're installing Active Directory, there's two steps. One, you have to install the role. And two, you have to then, after the role is installed, promote the domain controller. All the configuration for the domain is done on that promotion step. The reason it's good to point out that these are two separate steps is that in the exam, you're going to get prompted. There will be probably a handful of exam questions where they're going to show you what the question will be like, what PowerShell steps you have to do in order to do a function. So to use this, what we're looking at as an example, this is two steps. It's install the role, promote the domain controller. So if it was a PowerShell related question in the exam, it's not really that important for you to know the PowerShell commands, despite what Microsoft might say. Oftentimes they'll recommend you should know the PowerShell. I've actually found it's more important when I'm studying to know what the process is, because then you can kind of wrap your mind around what the PowerShell commands might be. In this case, you'd have two. Install server role Active Directory. That's probably not exact, but it's close. And the other one is promote domain controller, whatever, with all of your parameters. Those are two separate steps that happen in two separate orders. And thinking like that and really paying attention to what the different steps you're doing in order to configure something will help with those PowerShell questions. Oftentimes then you can just reason out by looking at the commands, what the commands are without ever actually having to know them. I'm going to wait for a little bit and cut ahead to when this installation is finished, and I'll be right back. Okay, the Active Directory role is now finished. This is showing its installation succeeded. It also says configuration required, which is a reference to that promote domain controller. After this is done, you'll see up in Server Manager in this top right corner, we have a little notification flag. This is saying, hey, you've installed it, you need to configure it. So click on this, and right here you have this option, promote this server to a domain controller. When we're setting up a new domain, this is now step one, and this is where we're going to define what that domain actually is. I'm going to talk about some of this stuff, and then when we get to the next step, which is adding a domain controller to an existing domain, I'll talk about some of the more features. But right now I'm going to focus for this menu on what is required to install a new Active Directory domain from scratch, meaning you have nothing defined yet and you're creating everything from the beginning. There is a lot of thought that can go into everything you're defining on this step, and typically if you're doing this in a corporate environment, you only do this once. So this is a very critical thing. You probably should be talking to someone who's got a lot of Active Directory experience before you define some of this stuff, because it does make an impact every decision. For our lab environment, I'm going to talk about each element and kind of some of the things to consider. But you probably you'll be lucky if you ever have to do this in production, because this is such an uncommon thing. Most companies already have Active Directory domains, so you don't have to configure them. But good to do in our lab, and has to do for our AZ-800 exam. So in the screen, you have three options: new forest, new domain to an existing forest, or add a domain controller to an existing domain. This is obviously the most common one and what is selected out of default. However, what we're going to be doing is add a new forest. If you see the word forest, we're going to talk about this more in the next video where you're talking about configuring forests, but essentially every domain exists in a forest. And in my experience from my life, I've always only ever seen a one-to-one relationship between forest and domains. But technically, you can have a forest with multiple domains inside that forest, and then you have one master domain that manages it. That's uncommon because that was really created for a time when the internet wasn't as fast as it was, and you're trying to manage speeds and everything. Like I said, I'm going to get into that more into the next exam video. But for now, to create a new domain, you'll know you need to select Add New Forest. Now, the only thing you then have to define here is the root domain name. If you have not watched my DNS basics video, that might be a really good thing to pause and watch right here, because what you're doing here when you're defining the root domain name is actually defining like the DNS name for your domain that everybody is going to use. This is the top level domain for your Active Directory domain, so to speak. It's good to know DNS when you understand this, and this goes back to the whole heart that I drew on the board. Active Directory and DNS are hand in hand. The advice I would give you when you're trying to think up a domain name is twofold. One, try to keep it relatively short because you end up typing it a lot anytime you're creating a DNS record or typing something for the domain. So short is just easier to type. Not super important, but something that's just kind of easy, practical thing to know. Second, I would personally avoid ever using a website domain name. Like I could name my domain google.com and now all my traffic works, but obviously that's in conflict with a public internet domain, google.com, which is going to cause you DNS issues in the future and make things more difficult to troubleshoot. What I always like to do is either end with a .local or end with a .custom, something that wouldn't ever map to a public domain name. So that's my two advice. And for me, for my lab environments, I always just do dzab.local because it satisfies both those requirements. It's not a public domain and it's short, easy to type. So this is the lab domain name that I'm defining. Hit next. And here you're specifying some of the options about the domain controller itself. I'm going to talk about some of these a little bit later, but for now, the two things that are important to note, you have to make it a DNS server, so you have to make sure that box is checked, and that because it's the first server in your domain, it's going to be a global catalog server. I will talk about that when we're adding our second one and what that means. The other thing you have to do here is define a DSRM password. You're going to want to save this, but the DSRM password is specific to each domain controller. I always like to share them so that each DC is using the same one, but that doesn't have to be the case. You also very rarely ever use this, so you just kind of save it right down somewhere and have it for reference. Not super important. You can also, if you ever actually need this password, you can perform a command to change it before you actually need to use it. That way, it's not really that important to save this, but you have to define it. So hit next. This errors, I've always seen this every time I've done this, you can kind of ignore it. And hit next again. And this NetBIOS domain name is important to think about as well. When you are logging into a domain computer, if you've been around any Active Directory environment, you've probably seen the NetBIOS domain name. Typically, historically, when you're logging into a domain computer, you type in the NetBIOS name / your username to sign into that computer. And the NetBIOS name then tells the computer that you're logging into, use my domain account. So this is that prefix that you type in before every user that you're logging into. Another thing to note, keep this short. I don't want my full name here because then anytime you're logging into domain controller, or if you're on one server logging into the other, you have to type in that whole NetBIOS name every time. I always say limit this to 4 characters if you possibly can. It does try to take your value that you specified in the domain name, mine was dzab.local, and predefine this for you. Usually that works just fine. So I'm going to leave this as dzab, hit next. And it's going to prompt you then for where you want to actually install the domain files on the server. I'm just going to use the default directory here, but if you're promoting your DCs and you have like an extra data disk that has more storage and you're really a big environment, you can move this to a different drive if you want. I always just keep the defaults here. So hit next and it will tell you all the options that you have configured. And then last step that it will do is it'll go through a prerequisites check and check a handful of things and give you any warnings if something might not quite be right. I've always seen warnings on here and you can almost always ignore them. So there's some security settings here. There is a notice here about not having static IPs defined. Typically that's bad practice on domain controller, but because I'm creating this in Azure, you're not supposed to define static IP addresses on the server in Azure, but Azure does have them statically assigned, so you don't really have to worry about it the same way. Other than that, these are just warnings. So it does say that I'm good to go. I have a green check mark and I'm going to go ahead and hit install, and it will now create my new Active Directory domain and promote this as a domain controller. And then when it's done, it's going to restart. So don't be surprised when you get kicked off, because it's going to kick off, restart the server, and when it comes back up, it will be a domain controller. So let's go ahead and cut off here, and we will come back once the server is ready to go. Okay, you can't see the pop-up. Let me switch back to my desktop. You can see here, I've been kicked off and I have a little pop-up saying my remote desktop session is ended. That's because the role finished installing, the server restarted. So all I have to do is reconnect here. Now, whatever local user you were logged into the DC on is automatically promoted as a domain admin on your domain after the server itself has been promoted. So I can leave these credentials the same, and it should allow me to reconnect. And you'll notice now when I connect, it's prompted me and says, I realize this is hard to see, but it says the certificate on the computer is now dc1.dzab.local, which is that domain name that we specified and configured. So I'm going to go ahead and connect, and let's switch back into my RDP session here, and let's take a look at what was configured. Okay, so this is my DC1. Now, when we went to add the features or add the roles, I hit manage, right? Add roles, remove roles. Now, if I go to tools, this shows you all of the tools for managing the roles that have already been installed on the server. The two really common consoles for interacting with Active Directory are either Active Directory users and computers, which is the old school console. Anybody who's been around Active Directory for a long time usually prefers this. Otherwise, anybody who was an Active Directory admin from more modern times, I've seen a lot of people use the Active Directory Administrative Center instead, which is kind of the same console, same information, just an updated view. I'm not really fond of this, so you'll see me use the users and computer console much more myself. And here you can see there's not much here. This is all the default domain structures that are already built out. But if I go to my domain controllers OU right here, you'll see DC1 is my first domain controller. And if I go to users, here is my lab admin user that was the user I logged into the server under, and it's automatically been created and promoted as domain admin right there. So I'll talk more about everything I went over there later, but just showing you AD is now set up and configured. The other thing that has been set up automatically on the server, if I go to tools and go to DNS, this is my DNS console. And if I open the server and go to forward lookup zones, I now have a DNS zone for my Active Directory domain. dzab.local matches dzab.local right here. And that is how queries in Active Directory work. DNS queries hit the DNS server, and then it can respond with information. So everything here is configured. And that's all you have to do to get a domain started, create a new forest. So that's one of the exam objectives. The next objective for this section is installing a domain controller in Azure. Now, we are already in Azure, so the best we can do is kind of mimic what that's going to be like. Now, if you remember from the chart over here, the two prerequisites for adding a server to a domain are network connectivity and DNS. I'm doing pauses there so you can hopefully know the answer off the top of your head. I have two servers deployed with this lab environment. The next one is called DC2. So let me just see. It does look like I can look up the name. So from this server, I will open. It's not letting me search. I will open remote desktop, and I'm going to connect to DC2. And you'll notice right here, do you remember what this little prefix was called? That is the NetBIOS domain name. And you'll notice it's trying to use domain credentials because it has my domain / in user. This server we're logging into isn't on the domain yet. So instead, I'm going to go to a different user and type in ./labadmin. This / means log in using a local user account that exists on the server I'm connecting to, not my domain account. Labadmin, type in the password I specified, and I'm connecting to DC2. So, yep. Okay, we are loaded on this server now. I tried to, when I was thinking about the lab environment that I wanted to set up and have you guys work in, I was debating whether I was going to try and come up with some other symbolic way of indicating that if you're installing a domain controller from Azure connecting to your on-prem environment, that you have to do some step there to connect the two. Like I mentioned, if you're in Azure and you have a network in Azure, you need usually a VPN connection or an express route to your on-prem because they have to be connected. So I was thinking, well, maybe I will use a Windows firewall from DC1, and you have to go into the firewall and enable that to represent that. But none of those are really a true representation doing the networking required to connect Azure and on-prem. So rather than do that, I just kind of left it. But what I'm going to do is show you how we check the two different requirements that we have, DNS and network connectivity. These tests might be familiar with you if you're an IT admin. The first one to test network connectivity is what we use everywhere, which is literally just ping, and then you can use the IP address or you can use the name. In this case, Azure has assigned the IP addresses dynamically. I don't know what they are for the server, but I know that I've created the domain on DC1. So I'm going to type in ping DC1, and if I get a response, that means I have network connectivity to this server. You'll notice server is also on 10.0.0.4. So my first prerequisite, have network connectivity, is working. I don't know why I didn't end, but that's a good one. The second one is DNS. Now, there's a really, really easy way to know, is DNS working on, do I have the right DNS connection to the domain? I'm going to type in ping, and then I'm going to type in my domain name. This is the domain name that you specified when you were creating the domain. Mine was dzab.local. If I ping that, what happens? Bam. Could not find host dzab.local. What that means is I do not have DNS configured, and I have to configure that to work before I can connect to an Active Directory domain. Because right now, if I went to go promote this server as a domain controller and I say, I want to promote this and I want to join it to the dzab.local domain, it can't find that domain. If I try and ping that domain, it doesn't exist. So how do we fix it? As a reminder, you can't really see this, but I talked about you have to configure the DNS settings on the server to talk to your existing domain controller. So let's do that. It's under the interface settings on any device you're connected to. This would be on a computer you're joined to the domain or a server. Go to change adapter options here. Right click on properties. I've always thought it was nuts how buried this menu is. Properties, go to IPv4 properties, and here are your static IP settings if you have them. I'm in Azure, I don't want to set these, but I do want to set the DNS server addresses. So from my first ping test here, I can see that the IP address of the domain controller that I want to connect to is 10.0.0.4. So I'm going to go here and set my domain DNS server to 10.0.0.4. This is telling this server that I'm on, for any DNS query, the server I want you to look at is DC1 on 10.0.0.4. Because this is in Azure, and if DNS is not working, you're kind of screwed. For this lab environment, I'm going to set my secondary DNS to something public, just so if for whatever reason the first one doesn't work, the second one will still resolve to whatever Azure services it needs. So that's just a lab environment tweak that I do here, but it's not super critical, and definitely not something you do in a regular domain environment. Hit that, close, and now that that's my DNS server, let's try the same thing again. Ping dzab.local, and now it's going to go hit that new server and respond, hey, here's dzab.local. So now I have network connectivity and DNS connectivity. I am ready to promote my domain controller. This is the considerations you need to do anytime you're promoting a domain controller in Azure, on-prem, anywhere. Those are the things you need. So same process. I'm going to add the role, and I am going to then promote it. So I'm going to fast forward here while I do all this stuff. Okay, role installed. Let's go configure this. So promote the server to a domain controller. Okay. If we're at the screen, what option do you think we choose? Pretty straightforward, right? Add domain controller to an existing domain. Now, to do this, you specify your domain name. This is the same one we configured in the other server, dzab.local. The thing that's different now already about what we did previously is you have now to specify credentials that you use to connect to the domain. Now, this is because on this server, we're logged in as the local lab_admin account. That local account, even though you have the same user in the domain, isn't a domain account. It's a local account that only exists on this server. So I have to type in credentials for a domain account. I'm going to pause here for 2 seconds and talk a little bit more about that NetBIOS name. I can type in dzab/lab_admin, and this would work just fine. There's a more modern way of typing usernames that you might want to get in the habit of using instead, and that is using what's called a user principal name. So this is dzab/labadmin, but will also work is if I type in the account name and then hit @ like an email, and then type in my domain name. So labadmin@dzab.local. This looks like an email address, but this is called the user principal name. This is a different format, but will also work exactly the same for logging into a domain. The reason you might want to get used to using a user principal name instead is it's a more modern username format. Both work. But if you start interacting with your Entra Active Directory environment and you have users synced, which we'll talk about later on in the exam content, you're going to log in using your user principal name instead of the NetBIOS name. That is the attribute, the login attribute that's synced between users. We'll talk more about that, but I just want to point that out, especially if you're setting up a new domain and you're training your business users on how to log into their computers. If you're going with an Entra-only environment with no Active Directory, you have to use the user principal name format. That's the only one that works. Otherwise, once you start to sync, there are services that require UPN versus NetBIOS name, and it's easier just to have everybody always use the UPN. That's a complete side tangent, but worth pointing out here. So, assuming those credentials worked, if I hit next, username and password is incorrect. So let's try this again. I will laugh if this is one of the few places where the NetBIOS name is actually required. Let me just type in the password carefully and see if that works. Next. Yeah, it did work. Yeah, so I just typed the password wrong. But this screen looks familiar, I'm sure. This is the same thing we saw in the last one. I'm going to make up a DSRM password quick, and then we'll talk about the other options. Okay. There's a few things I want to talk about on this screen, but before I talk about those, I also want to make another kind of general statement about taking Microsoft exams and the type of questions you'll encounter. I talked already about how you'll have PowerShell questions, and really it's more important for you to know the steps in the process, because then you can generally kind of map those to what PowerShell commands look correct, even if you don't know them. There's another type of questions you'll see really commonly that I really can't stand, but are very popular in Microsoft exams, and that is they will give you a screen, like an interface screen, a screenshot or something like this, and they will tell you if you're configuring property X, what tab or what you need to click on in this screen to get to that property to set it. I'm not a fan of those questions because if I'm doing this live in a business, as long as I know what console I'm in, it doesn't matter where I click. I could just click through the tabs until I find the right one. But for some exam content, they want you to know exactly where certain things are located. In this case, one of the section topics that we would need to cover is installing a read-only domain controller. That is in this domain controller options screen. There's a checkbox right here where if I check this, when it promotes the domain controller, it will make it a read-only domain controller. There's not much I'm going to say about that other than about read-only domain controllers other than the only use case for a read-only domain controller is if you have if you're promoting a server to be a domain controller and that server is not physically secure, meaning users are in the same room as the server or it's someplace with a lot of traffic where people go in and out. That is a security risk for Active Directory. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it is a risk. And in those cases, that's where Microsoft recommends you use read-only domain controllers because it limits the values that are saved on that server. So if someone were to steal it, they have less information accessible to them. I'm not going to get into that. That's not important for you to know for this exam. The only thing you need to know for this particular objective is where the option is to configure that, which is on this screen. All you have to do is check that box, and now it becomes a read-only domain controller instead of a normal domain controller. If you are curious and want to know more information about those, the AZ-800 exam, I already have a video on what they are, how to configure them, and how to manage them, but it's not important for you to know right now. The other option I'm going to talk about here, there's an option called Global Catalog. Back in the day, when internet lines were not very fast and it was not reliable to send data, you'd specify 1 or 2 servers as your global catalog servers, meaning they contain a copy of everything in the domain. And then other servers wouldn't be that, and then they contain only some like local information that they actually care about. Nowadays, everything is modern, internet is fast, you never have to worry about this. Like there's a recommended threshold of like 28 kilobytes per second to support this, and that's obviously every connection nowadays. So the best practice is every domain controller should also be a global catalog server. There's never really a situation where you want to change this. You can also uncheck the DNS box if you don't want this to also be a DNS server, but in this case we're going to leave it because it's best just to have DNS on the domain controllers if they're doing DNS. Typically, you do limit this to 2 because you can only specify 2 DNS servers per server. So you'll have like 2 domain controllers that are DNS and the rest won't be, but it doesn't matter. You can leave that checked or not. It's all going to sync. So that's the important options on this screen. I'm not making this a read-only domain controller because this is imitating the Azure DC you're setting up. Hit next. This is that same error that I got in the last one. I don't know what caused this, but it's not really that important. So hit next. And then finally, this is asking you, where do you want to populate that original domain data from? Meaning, you're going to join the domain. As soon as you join the domain and become a domain controller, you have to copy all of the domain information locally so you have a copy of it. Where do you want to replicate from? In this case, you can specify individual servers if there's one that's closer. You can specify any domain controller, in which case they'll just pick one and go. Otherwise, you also have the option to install from media if you want, but this is very uncommon. I've never done this and I don't really know how it works, but it's an option. So if you wanted to like use a CD or a drive or something to install from, you can. In this case, I'm going to leave it at any domain controller. Hit next. This is the same install directory path that we saw in the last one. Here's my options. Next, it'll do the same prerequisites check, and then we are good to install and permit our server. So I'm going to click install here. It's going to install, it's going to restart, and I'll drop my connection, and we will be back in 2 seconds, and we'll kind of take a look at what we've configured here. All right, I got the prompt that the server I was connected to is restarting, so I got disconnected from it. I am back here on DC1, which I don't know if it says that somewhere. Doesn't matter. Anyways, this is the first domain controller. So now, if I go back to DNS and refresh this, I'll have a record for DC1 and DC2. And if I look into my Active Directory domain here and go to domain controllers, whoop, refresh, now I have 2 domain controllers, DC1 and DC2. Just to close the loop on this, both of these domain controllers are now DNS servers, and typically what you want to make sure you do is that the DCs are configured to talk to each other as their DNS servers. I already did this on DC2 as a prerequisite to join into the domain. I did not have to do this on DC1 because it was the first DNS server in the domain. But I'm going to go back into my settings, and you will see that even though I didn't configure this, it already has an IP address set here for its DNS server. This 127.0.0.1 address is kind of a built-in Windows address to talk to itself. So if you ever see this, it means ask yourself for DNS first. This is very common for domain controllers, especially if they are DNS servers, they'll have it configured this way. You also want to go and configure a secondary server, which in our case is the IP for DNS or for DC2. So now what I'm telling it is, if you're performing a DNS lookup, use yourself first. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work, or if you can't find the address, use the second DC second. So now I have kind of a redundant DNS configuration because I have two DNS servers. Hit OK, hit close. You'll also notice, if you remember on our last server, we used that public IP as a secondary. I didn't configure that here, so it's a little risky in case something breaks in Azure, but we're not too worried about it. Okay. So that is the DC related exam objectives. We talked about standing up a new domain. We talked about adding a domain controller from Azure. We talked about what options you configure if you're going to make that a read-only domain controller. The last topic in this lesson is talking about FSMO roles. Now, do you remember what those were when I explained them at the beginning of the lesson? I'm going to pause 2 seconds, let you think about it. If you recall, FSMO roles, because every single Active Directory domain controller is supposed to hold a copy of all the domain information, there are certain functions that can only be performed by a single server at a time to prevent conflicts or replication errors from occurring. So every FSMO role ties to one of those functions. I'm not going to break up or go into the details of what they are, but you need to know how to look up who's the FSMO role holders. You might also hear a reference in business to a primary domain controller. There's no such thing anymore in a modern Active Directory environment to a primary domain controller. That was a thing way back in like the 2003 days of Active Directory. But there is a primary domain controller FSMO role that still exists. Or if you ever get asked what is your primary domain controller, really what that is a reference to is what DC is holding your FSMO roles. Because typically they're always assigned to a single DC as a best practice, just so you can kind of have one DC doing all those critical operations. But the exam objectives is how to transfer those roles, which is not too hard. There's two primary methods. You can use a GUI-based method, which actually is super tedious and difficult, or you can use a command line interface. So I'm going to pull up a browser, and I'm actually going to type in transfer FSMO GUI. And I'm only doing this because I want you guys to get an idea of how to do this by a graphical interface. Ironically, he has to do it by PowerShell, which is like the easiest way to do it. I actually haven't looked at this ahead of time. So here it lists what those actual roles are. PDC emulator stands for primary domain controller emulator. So these are the 5 different roles, and hopefully it'll show us how we actually do this. Here we go. Okay, so here's the instructions on how to transfer some of them, and let's go ahead and try this. So it has you going into Active Directory users and computers. You right click on the domain, you go to Operations Masters, and you'll see right here I have RID, RIDmaster, PDC emulator, and infrastructure admin. And if I go back to this little document or this page here and scroll up, RIDmaster, PDC emulator, and infrastructure master. You have three of the 5 FSMO roles. But this is what I wanted to show you, and this is why I say it's kind of a pain to do this via the GUI. Only 3 of the roles are here. So I can only transfer these 3 using the graphical interface here. Otherwise, if I scroll all the way down, you have to run a snap-in for what is Active Directory schema. You actually have to load a schema snap-in, which isn't native and doesn't make a lot of sense, in order to access those other 2 operations manager roles. It's just tedious. It takes a lot of time, and it's finicky. There's a much, much easier way to do this, and that is using a command line interface. You'll notice the last 2 documents we had PowerShell commands listed to do this. You might want to take a look at these just so you're familiar with them, because this might be what's on the exam. The easier way to do this, my preferred method for transferring roles, is actually to use the old school command line utility NTDSUtil to do it. So if I pull up this command line, the first thing you can do is there's a really easy command that works on every domain controller to look up where the FSMO roles are currently being held. Do netdom query FSMO, and that will check the domain and it will say, here are your 5 roles: schema master, domain name, PDC, RID, infrastructure master, and here are the servers that hold it. You'll notice all of them are being held by our DC1 server right here. So for the sake of our objectives, let's transfer those roles to our second DC, DC2. So in order to do that, I'm going to type in NTDSUtil, and I'm actually going to go through like the process of looking up the commands as I do it as well, so hopefully make this easier. I wonder if I can make this a little better too. Bam. All right. Make this a little bigger for the screen here. Okay, so I type in NTDSUtil as one word, and that takes me to the utility here. And now if I type in help to list the commands, these are the commands that are available. And what I'm looking for is this roles command right here. So type in roles, that will take me to the FSMO maintenance screen. And now if I type in help, you can see I have the options. Either I have commands to seize the roles. These seize operations are forcibly taking the roles from another server. You use these in like a domain recovery situation where like one of your DCs has died and it is not possible to recover it, and then you need to take the roles forcibly from that server. What we're going to do is transfer the roles, which is the correct, healthy way of doing it. But in order to do that, we first need to connect to the domain and connect to the server that we want to transfer the roles to. So notice right here, there is a connections button. So I'm going to type that first. Connections, help, and right here are connect. Connect to domain, connect to server. So connect to domain dzab.local, because that's my domain name, and it says I'm connected. Now it says connect to server, and we're going to do dc2.dzab.local. And connected to DC2 using credentials locally logged in user. So now we are connected both to the domain dzab.local and the server dc2.local, and that is all that we have to do. So I'm going to hit quit out of this screen and go back to our FSMO maintenance screen. And just to show, if I type in help, these are the commands for this screen, and all we have to do is copy each one of these commands. So infrastructure master, enter, and it says, are you sure you want the domain role of infrastructure master transferred to the server DC2? That's what we're doing, so all I have to do is hit yes. And now I can just copy each one of these commands. Yes. 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 And last one, schema master. And now all of my roles are transferred. So let me quit out of this. I'm back at a regular command prompt. And if I do that same query again, netdom query FSMO, all of my FSMO roles are now showing they're on DC2 instead of DC1. That's as easy as it is. Like you saw, there are PowerShell commands to do this. I've never used a PowerShell. To me, this has been so easy because literally it's like, you can use the help menu to navigate through it, and it's just like copy, paste, and you're done. It also saves the time of trying to navigate through the GUI and load extra snap-ins that you don't normally see, stuff like that. This has been my preferred method forever, but you should just be aware. You can do it by the graphical interface. You can do it via PowerShell, or you can do it by CLI. Obviously, the PowerShell or CLI-based ones are going to be the simplest. That does take us to the end of our demo lab environment for this lesson. And that's all the objectives we have covered for this first section. And we'll be back next week, probably talk about the more like replication-based technologies for AD. So that's managing forests, managing AD sites and services, stuff like that. So let's quick cut to a recap of what we talked about today, and we will prep for next week. All right, now that we are done with our lab environment, just to kind of close the loop on the whole Terraform lab deployment, this is the same thing you can do. If I'm done with my Azure resources, all I have to do is type in Terraform destroy, not Terraform destroy. And then if I use this auto approve flag, then I do not need to hit yes. And it's going to prompt me again for my subscription ID here in a second. Copy, paste, and the same password. And now Terraform will go out to Azure, delete all the resources it was using, and you will be back to not paying for anything. This is why I like using Terraform. One command to deploy the resources, one command to delete them, and then you can manage everything by a code base, which is what I prefer to do anyways, and that's our lab environment. So let's recap what we talked about today really quickly. First thing I'll talk about, you have the GitHub repo for AZ-800 that I've linked in the description below. This has resources I'm designing for you to run your own labs. Going back to that intro video, it has lab scenarios for you to accomplish and a quiz for you to take to try and kind of seal that knowledge in your brain. So our lesson today was under domain services, lesson 1 for build DCs. If you go to the lab challenges, here's the link to either deploy by GUI or Terraform, and then I have 2 different scenarios that you have that you can work through here yourself to try and figure out and test your memory and how to do it. I also, if you go to quiz, have a couple of quiz questions here that you can use to quiz yourself, also to test to see where you're at. And then finally, solutions. Here are the actual step-by-step instructions to the labs, as well as the answers to the quiz questions themselves here. I may restructure this as I continue to build out lessons. I'm not exactly sure, but those resources are available. So going back to the recap, we talked about some of our domain prerequisites in order to set up Active Directory. We talked about how you need network connectivity in order to promote a domain controller. You can't promote one unless you're able to talk to the original DC. We talked about how Active Directory and DNS are 2 peas in the pod. You cannot have AD working without DNS, and in order to promote a domain controller, the DNS server for that server you're promoting has to be talking to one of your existing domain controllers in order to resolve. We talked a little bit about domain names and NetBIOS names. You remember the domain name is literally your DNS name that you're using to connect to the domain. So ours that we configured was dzab.local. We talked about how you might want to consider not conflicting with an existing public domain, or you might have problems with your DNS issues going forward in the future. We also talked about how the NetBIOS name is used to log in. NetBIOS / user. And then we also, as a last point, talked about how you can use user at domain name for your user principal format to log in. Covered all that stuff. We talked about read-only domain controllers and how to specify if you're promoting a domain controller as a read-only domain controller. If you remember, it's on the promote domain controller screen under the same tab as configuring a DNS server and a global catalog server. There's a checkbox for specifying this will be a read-only domain controller. Finally, we talked about FSMO roles using netdom query FSMO to look up what server is holding the FSMO roles currently. And we also talked about how to use either the GUI or the command line interface to transfer those roles. Now, that covers all of the objectives for this section. Next week, we're going to be talking about more replication-based technologies in AD, which is like managing forests, managing sites and services, a little bit less exciting, a little more obscure, but foundational for you to know. So I look forward to the video next week and seeing you guys again. Thank you for watching. As always, if you like and subscribe, it really helps me in the channel and helps me to continue to do this. So thank you all, and I will see you next week.